The night Martin Cole almost died, it was raining so hard in Chicago that the windshield wipers on his $340,000 Bentley couldn't keep up. He was doing 92 miles an hour on the I-90, and there was a half-empty bottle of whiskey sitting in the cup holder. His phone had been ringing for 40 minutes straight, his CFO, his attorney, his ex-wife, and he had ignored every single one of them. He wasn't running from them. He was running from something far worse. He was running from himself. The car hit standing water near the Eden Split, and for 4 seconds that Martin Cole will describe to you today with the kind of precision that only a man who thought he was about to die can manage, the Bentley went completely weightless. Not skidding, not sliding, weightless, like the road had simply decided it was done with him. And in those 4 seconds, in the white silence before the guardrail caught the car and folded the front end like a piece of paper, Martin heard a voice. Not inside his head, not a thought, a voice, low, familiar, and impossibly calm. And it said 3 words that would change everything. 3 words he hadn't heard in 11 years, since the night they lowered his mother into the ground in a small cemetery in Rockford, Illinois. The voice said, "Come home, baby." That was October 14th. What happened in the months that followed is the kind of story people don't believe until they've lived long enough to know that life is stranger and more merciful than any of us ever give it credit for. Before we go any deeper into this story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click that subscribe button right now so you never miss any of our upcoming stories. Now let me ask you something before we go further. Have you ever been so successful on paper that you couldn't recognize yourself in the mirror anymore? Have you ever built something so large, so impressive, so undeniably real, and still felt like something essential was missing? Like the life you were living belonged to someone else, and you were just borrowing it? Because that's exactly where Martin Cole was the night his Bentley kissed that guardrail. Not broken, not poor, not unlucky. He had $2.3 billion to his name, a penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan, and a company that employed over 6,000 people. By every measurement that the world uses to judge a man's worth, Martin Cole was winning, and he was the most lost person on the planet. So what does a man like that do when his world stops making sense? What happens when the empire you spent your whole life building starts to feel like a prison? And what does it mean when a dead woman's voice finds you in the middle of the worst night of your life and says your name like she never left? Those are the questions at the heart of this story, and every single one of them gets answered before this video is over. Stay with us. Martin Cole grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment on the west side of Rockford, Illinois. His mother, Dorothy, worked double shifts at a nursing home 5 days a week and picked up laundry work on weekends. She was the kind of woman who never complained out loud, but Martin would sometimes find her sitting at the kitchen table at midnight with the bills spread out in front of her and her hands folded on top of them like she was praying. Sometimes she was. His father left when Martin was 7. No letter, no phone call. Just a Tuesday morning when the closet was half empty and his mother's eyes were red in a way he'd never seen before. Martin didn't cry. He walked to school that morning, sat down at his desk, and decided, with the cold, quiet certainty of a child who has just understood something terrible about the world, that he would never need anyone the way his mother needed his father. Never. He would be so strong, so self-sufficient, so iron-willed, that nothing and nobody would ever have that kind of power over him. He carried that decision into everything. He was the first in his family to go to college, working construction summers and grading papers as a TA to pay his way through the University of Illinois. He graduated in 3 years. He started his first company at 24, a small logistics software firm out of a studio apartment in Wicker Park, and by the time he was 31, he'd sold it for $47 million. He cried exactly once during that entire period. The day he handed his mother the keys to a house in the suburbs of Chicago, a real house, with a yard and a porch and a kitchen big enough to actually cook in. Dorothy Cole stood on that porch for a long time without saying anything. Then she turned around, put both her hands on her son's face, and said, "Martin, you are more than what you have. Don't you ever forget that." He didn't understand what she meant at the time. He thought it was just something mothers said. He filed it away and went back to work. Over the next 15 years, Martin built Colbridge Technologies into one of the most respected supply chain infrastructure companies in the country. Contracts with the federal government. Partnerships with 3 of the biggest retail brands in the world. revenue in the hundreds of millions. He was on magazine covers. He was on panels at Davos. He had a driver and a chef and an assistant who managed his calendar down to 15-minute increments. He married a woman named Claire, brilliant, patient, quietly funny. And they had a daughter named Ellie who had her grandmother Dorothy's same brown eyes and her father's same iron stubbornness. But somewhere around year 12 of building the empire, Martin stopped being present for any of it. He doesn't know exactly when it happened. He'll tell you that himself. He says it wasn't one moment. It was 1,000 small surrenders. The birthday dinners he left early. The school plays he missed entirely. The nights Claire reached for him in the dark, and he was already somewhere else in his head, running numbers, solving problems, managing crises that would evaporate by morning but felt, at the time, like the only things in the world that mattered. Dorothy died 4 years after the house. Pancreatic cancer. She was gone in 6 weeks from diagnosis to funeral. Martin flew home for the last 3 days, sat beside her hospital bed, held her hand, and didn't cry until he was in the rental car on the way back to the airport. He gave the eulogy in a voice so steady that people who didn't know him well thought he was coping remarkably. People who knew him well understood that he had simply shut something very deep inside himself into a very small, very dark room, and locked the door. After that, things with Claire slowly dissolved, not in fire and screaming, but in the sad, quiet way that marriages end when two people realize they've become strangers who share a mortgage. They separated 3 years later. Ellie was 9. Martin gave Claire everything she asked for in the divorce and told himself it was because he was fair-minded. The truth he wouldn't look at directly for years, was that he didn't fight for the marriage because he didn't know how to fight for something that required him to be vulnerable. He only knew how to fight for things made of numbers and strategy and leverage. And love, real love, does not negotiate on those terms. By the October of the accident, Martin Cole was 53 years old, worth more money than he could ever spend, and drinking most nights alone in a penthouse apartment that smelled like leather and cedar and the particular loneliness of a man who has everything and feels nothing. He hadn't spoken to Ellie, who was now 20, in 4 months. He had stopped calling because she had stopped answering, and somewhere along the way he had convinced himself that the silence meant she was fine, she was busy, she was young. He did not let himself think about the other possibility, that she had simply given up on him, the way he had given up on everyone who asked him to be more than his net worth. That was the man in the Bentley. That was the man on the I-90 doing 92 miles an hour in the rain. That was the man who heard his dead mother's voice in the 4 seconds before the guardrail stopped him from disappearing entirely. The paramedics who pulled Martin out of the car told him later that the impact should have been fatal. The front axle had collapsed. The airbags had deployed so violently that the steering column cracked. But Martin was sitting in the back seat when they found him, which made no physical sense, because his seatbelt was fastened in the front. The lead paramedic, a veteran of 16 years, told his partner on the way back to the station that he'd never seen anything like it. Martin had a cut above his left eye, 2 bruised ribs, and a blood alcohol level that was well above the legal limit. That was it. He sat in the Cook County Hospital ER for 3 hours before anyone from his office arrived. He sat in a plastic chair with a gauze bandage over his eye, still in his suit, holding his phone in both hands and not looking at it. For the first time in as long as he could remember, Martin Cole had absolutely nothing to do. No decision to make, no deal to close, no crisis to manage. Just the fluorescent buzz of an emergency room and the sound of other people's pain all around him. And the echo, if that's the right word for something that felt more real than anything in that room, of his mother's voice. "Come home, baby." He didn't tell anyone about the voice. Not the ER doctor. Not his attorney David Chun, who showed up at midnight looking like he'd been woken from a dead sleep. Not his assistant Rebecca, who called 17 times before he finally picked up. He filed it away the way he filed everything that didn't fit into his worldview. Quietly, quickly, without examination. He got home at 2 in the morning, sat down on his couch without taking off his jacket, and stared at the city lights through the floor-to-ceiling window for 4 hours. The police cited him for reckless driving. His PR team handled the story before it could become a story. 3 weeks passed. Martin went back to work. He told himself the voice had been the shock, the adrenaline, the whiskey. He told himself a lot of things. And then the dream started. The first one came on a Thursday night in early November. He was standing in the kitchen of the old apartment in Rockford. He was 7 years old, but he could think like himself, like the 53-year-old man he was, which is one of those disorienting details that make certain dreams feel less like imagination and more like memory. The linoleum floor was cold under his feet. The kitchen light was flickering the way it always did because his mother kept meaning to replace the bulb and never had the time. And Dorothy was standing at the stove with her back to him, humming something low and familiar that he couldn't quite identify, stirring something that smelled like the tomato soup she used to make on winter nights. He said, "Mom," and she turned around. She looked exactly as she had looked when he was 7, not the thin, tired woman of her last days, but Dorothy in her prime, warm-eyed and solid, wearing the yellow apron with the pocket that was always full of grocery receipts. She looked at him for a long time. Not sadly, not urgently, just really looked at him, the way she used to when she was trying to decide whether he was telling the truth. Then she said, "When's the last time you called Ellie?" Martin woke up at 3 a.m. with the question still in the air around him, so present it was almost visible. He sat on the edge of his bed in the dark for a long time. Then he picked up his phone and scrolled to Ellie's name. He stared at it. He put the phone down. He told himself it was the middle of the night. He told himself she wouldn't want to hear from him. He told himself it could wait until morning. It waited 6 more days. The second dream came the following week. Same kitchen, same flickering light, same yellow apron. This time Dorothy was sitting across from him at the table, and she slid a piece of paper across to him. On the paper was an address, a real address, one he recognized. The address of the nursing home in Rockford where she had worked for 22 years. Not the facility itself, but a specific room number. Room 114. When he woke up, Martin did something he almost never did. He searched his own memory. He sat with it. Room 114. He hadn't thought about that place in 15 years. But the number sat in his chest like something with weight. He went back to sleep and lay there with his eyes open until the sun came up, trying to understand what his mind, or whatever was sending him these dreams, was trying to tell him. On a cold Saturday morning in late November, without telling anyone where he was going, Martin Cole got in a rental car. The Bentley was in a repair shop, and he hadn't replaced it yet, and drove 2 hours south to Rockford, Illinois. If you're watching this, and you've ever gone back to a place that raised you, you know what it feels like to drive those streets again. The way certain corners carry the specific gravity of old selves. The way a gas station or a school parking lot can hold more emotional weight than any cathedral. Martin drove past the apartment building on the west side. The swing set in the courtyard was still there, rusted now, one chain missing. He sat in the car with the engine running for 10 minutes, not getting out, just looking. Then he drove to the nursing home. He didn't know exactly why. He had no plan. He told the woman at the front desk that he was Dorothy Cole's son, that Dorothy had worked there for more than 20 years, and that he'd like to look around if that was all right. The woman, whose name tag said Margaret, and who had the particular unflappable warmth of someone who had been working with aging people for a very long time, said, "Oh, Dorothy's Martin? Your mama talked about you every single day." "Every single day? Come on in, honey." That sentence hit him like a physical thing. He thanked her and walked inside. He went to the corridor where room 114 was. He stood outside it. There was an elderly man inside, clearly a resident, in a wheelchair near the window, a thin plaid blanket over his knees, looking out at the parking lot with the patient expression of someone who has made his peace with stillness. Martin didn't know him. He was about to turn and leave when Margaret appeared at his elbow. "That's Walter," she said. "He's been here about 8 years. No family that visits. He and your mama used to play checkers on Wednesdays. After she got sick, he stopped eating right for a while. He really missed her." Martin stood there. Walter hadn't looked up. He was 91 years old and alone in a room on a Saturday in November with a plaid blanket and a parking lot to look at. Martin walked in. He didn't have a speech prepared. He didn't have a strategy. He pulled a chair up next to Walter's wheelchair and said, "My name's Martin. Dorothy was my mother. I heard you two used to play checkers." Walter turned his head slowly and looked at him with pale blue eyes that were, despite everything, still sharp. "She never beat me," Walter said. "Not once in 3 years. Don't let anybody tell you different." Martin laughed. A real laugh. The kind that comes up from somewhere below your sternum without asking permission. He couldn't remember the last time he'd laughed like that. He stayed for 2.5 hours. If you're still watching, and I think most of you are, because you feel something happening in this story, drop "I'm still watching" in the comments right now. Let's see who's truly following this all the way through. Martin drove back to Chicago that evening with something different in his chest. Not peace exactly. More like the feeling of a window that had been sealed shut for years cracking open just slightly. Enough to let in the cold air, yes, but also the smell of something alive. He called Ellie from the car. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. He left a message that was short and a little clumsy and honest in a way his messages never usually were. "It's Dad. I know it's been a while. I know that's my fault. I was in Rockford today, and I was thinking about your grandmother, and I was thinking about you. I'd like to talk if you're willing. No pressure. I just wanted you to know I was thinking about you." He put the phone down and drove the rest of the way in silence. She didn't call back that night. The dreams continued through December. Dorothy came to him 3 more times, and each time she said things that weren't grand or mystical. They were small and specific and deeply personal. She told him he needed to call David Chun and apologize for the way he'd spoken to him during the Q3 restructuring, because David had been loyal to him for 9 years and didn't deserve the way he'd been treated. She told him the painting above the fireplace in his penthouse, a big abstract thing he'd bought at auction for $180,000 because his decorator said it was impressive, made her uncomfortable every time she saw it. And it was probably making him uncomfortable too, and he just didn't realize it. She told him that Ellie was scared of him, not because he was mean to her, but because he was so far away from her all the time that she'd stopped believing she could reach him. "She doesn't need money, Martin," Dorothy said in the last dream of December, stirring the tomato soup. "She needs her father to show up like a man who is actually present. You know the difference." Martin knew the difference. He called David Chun and apologized. David was quiet for a long moment on the other end of the phone and then said, "I've been waiting 2 years for that call, Martin. Thank you." Martin had the painting taken down the next morning and donated it to a hospital fundraiser auction. He didn't buy a replacement. For the first time in years, the fireplace wall was just a wall. He stood in front of it one evening with a glass of water. He'd stopped drinking in the weeks since the accident, quietly, without making an announcement of it, and realized it looked better. It looked more like a place where a person actually lived. Ellie called back on December 19th, 5 weeks after his message. He was in a board meeting when his phone lit up with her name, and he did something he had never once done in 15 years of running a company. He looked at his CFO, said, "I need to take this," and walked out of the room. His CFO stared after him like he'd just watched a man get struck by lightning and survive it. The call lasted 22 minutes. Most of it was awkward. Some of it was painful. Ellie told him things he didn't want to hear, in the way that only a 20-year-old who has been carrying hurt for a long time can say them, directly, without the diplomatic softening that adults learn to add to protect each other. She told him that she used to make excuses for him to her friends when he missed things. She told him that for a long time she thought his absence meant something was wrong with her, that she wasn't worth showing up for. She said it without cruelty, just as fact, which somehow made it harder to hear. Martin sat in a hallway outside the boardroom and listened and did not defend himself. He said, "I know. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Ellie." When they hung up, he pressed his back against the wall and closed his eyes for a long time. His CFO found him there 4 minutes later, still not ready to go back in. He spent Christmas in Rockford, not in a hotel. He called his mother's old neighbors, the Harises from the 2nd floor, who he hadn't spoken to in 9 years, and they let him come for dinner. He sat at a table with people who had known him as a boy, who remembered him riding his bike in the parking lot and helping Mr. Harris carry groceries up the stairs. They didn't care about his company or his net worth. They just remembered him as Dorothy's son. For the first time in a decade, that felt like enough. He visited Walter again on Christmas afternoon. He brought a checker set from a Walmart on the way over, and Walter beat him 3 games straight. And at the end of the 3rd game, Walter looked at him with those pale blue eyes and said, "You're a lot like her, you know. Your mother. She never won either, but she never stopped coming back." Martin drove home through the dark with the heater running and the radio off and cried for most of the 2 hours. Not the controlled, private crying he'd allowed himself at his mother's funeral. Real crying. The kind that takes over your body, that doesn't care that you're in a car on the interstate, that has been waiting inside you for 11 years to be let out. He pulled over twice. He didn't care. Something was breaking open, and for the first time in his life, Martin Cole did not try to stop it. In January, Martin did something that shocked everyone who knew him. He announced that he was stepping back from the day-to-day operations of Coalbridge Technologies. Not selling the company. Not retiring. Stepping back. He brought in a CEO he'd been grooming for 2 years, a woman named Sandra Park who was, by every objective measure, better at running the machine than Martin at this point in his life. And he gave her the authority she'd deserved for years. He moved his office from the penthouse floor to a smaller space in the building 2 blocks over. He cleared his calendar of everything except the things that genuinely required him. The press took it as a sign of trouble. There were articles suggesting the company was struggling, that Martin was losing his grip, that something was wrong behind the scenes. He read one of the articles over coffee one morning and felt almost nothing. Not defensiveness, not anxiety. Something that, if he was being accurate, was closest to amusement. But then came the twist that none of us, not the people in Martin's life, not the journalists writing the articles, and certainly not Martin himself, saw coming. In early February, Martin received a certified letter from an attorney in Rockford he'd never heard of. Inside was a brief note explaining that a woman named Patricia Wynne, who had been a colleague of Dorothy Cole's at the nursing home for 11 years, had passed away in the previous month and, in her will, had left Martin Cole something. Not money. A box. A small wooden box that Patricia's instructions said had been in her possession since the week after Dorothy's death, given to her by Dorothy herself with specific instructions that it be delivered to Martin when the time was right. Martin drove to Rockford the following weekend and collected the box from the attorney's office. He sat in his car in the parking lot for a long time before he opened it. Inside was a collection of things that stopped his breathing entirely. There were 2 photographs of Martin as a boy, one of him at maybe 8 years old, riding the bike in the apartment parking lot, and one of him in his cap and gown at his college graduation, Dorothy standing beside him with her hand on his chest and her face full of something that needed no translation. There was a folded letter, yellowed slightly at the edges, in Dorothy's handwriting. And beneath the letter, at the bottom of the box, was a worn piece of paper, a grocery list from what looked like the late 1980s, with Dorothy's neat small cursive listing bread, milk, tomato soup, apples, and at the bottom, in the margin, in ink that had faded but was still perfectly legible, 3 words written in his mother's hand. Martin is enough. He read those 3 words for a very long time. He thought about the 7-year-old who had decided he needed to be invincible. He thought about the man who had built an empire to fill a space inside him that could never be filled by anything you could put on a balance sheet. He thought about Dorothy at the kitchen table with the bills spread out, hands folded. He thought about the 4 seconds of weightlessness before the guardrail. He thought about the voice. Then he unfolded the letter. Dorothy had written it about a month before she died, when she must have known the end was close, but before she'd lost the strength to write. It was 4 paragraphs long. He would never read it publicly, and no one who knows him today presses him on exactly what it said. But Martin has shared the gist of it in 2 conversations since then, and what he said is this. His mother wrote that she knew him better than he knew himself, and that she knew he would spend his life trying to earn something he already had. She wrote that she had prayed every day, every single day since he was a little boy, that one day he would stop running long enough to understand that the love she had for him was not conditional on his achievements. It never was. It never would be. She wrote that she believed he would find his way back to himself eventually. She didn't know when or how, but she believed it with everything she had. And she wrote that if she wasn't around when it happened, she wanted him to know she was proud. Not of the company, not of the money, of the boy who carried groceries upstairs for the neighbors and sat with her at the kitchen table when she was worried and chose, over and over again, to be kind even when the world hadn't been particularly kind to him. That boy, she wrote, is who you really are. The rest is just what happened while you were being him. Martin sat in that parking lot for close to an hour. When he finally started the car and pulled out onto the road, he called Ellie, not because something had happened, just because he wanted to hear her voice. She answered on the second ring. Today, Martin Cole still runs Coalbridge Technologies in a meaningful sense. He's the executive chairman. He's involved in the big decisions. He still cares deeply about the company he built from a studio apartment in Wicker Park. But he's no longer the man who lives in it. That's the best way to put it. He no longer lives inside the work. He works. He comes home. And home, slowly, carefully, imperfectly, has become a real place again. He sees Ellie every other week. They go to dinner, and she tells him about her classes and her friends and the things she's struggling with. And he listens, actually listens, without checking his phone, without planning what he's going to say next. And he tells her, occasionally, about the things he's struggling with too. It's uncomfortable sometimes. Growth usually is. But Ellie told him recently, over pasta at a small Italian place on the north side, that she was glad he'd called that November, that she'd almost sent the voicemail to her trash without listening to it. But something had made her listen. She wasn't sure what. He goes back to Rockford once a month. He visits Walter every time. Walter is 92 now, and still sharp, and still claims he was never once beaten at checkers by Dorothy Cole. Martin brings the same checker set from Walmart every time, and every time Walter wins, and Martin is beginning to think that's exactly as it should be. Martin removed the whiskey from his penthouse and has not replaced it. He doesn't make a religion out of not drinking, he'll tell you that, but he doesn't need it the way he needed it before, and he understands now what it was filling in. The mornings are different without it. They're quieter. He'll stand at the window with a cup of coffee and watch the sun come up over Lake Michigan and feel, genuinely feel, the particular gift of being alive and awake and here for it. He doesn't talk about the dreams publicly. He's talked about the accident in a few interviews, framing it the way most people in his position would, as a wake-up call, a moment of recklessness that he's grateful didn't end worse. But the dreams, the voice, the wooden box in the attorney's office, those he keeps close. Not out of embarrassment, just out of the understanding that some things are not meant for the world at large. Some things are just yours. What he does say, in the rare interview or conversation where he's asked about the change in him, and people do ask, because the change is visible, measurable, real, is this: I spent 30 years building a life that looked like success from the outside. And I was good at it. But I was building it on top of a 7-year-old's decision never to need anyone. That's not strength. That's just a very expensive way to be scared. He pauses, always at that point. And then he says, my mother knew. She always knew. I just had to get out of my own way long enough to hear her. Think about that. Think about the people in your life. Maybe the ones who've already passed. Maybe the ones who are still here, who have tried to tell you something true about yourself that you weren't ready to hear. Think about the ways we armor ourselves against love. Think about how long it sometimes takes us to come home. Think about what it would mean to stop running, just for one evening, and sit in the kitchen with the person who knows you best, and let them look at you the way Dorothy looked at Martin in those dreams. Not with judgment, not with disappointment, just with the full, patient, unconditional recognition of someone who sees exactly who you are and loves that person completely. That's the gift. That's always been the gift. We just spend so much of our lives thinking we have to earn it. And sometimes it takes a guardrail on the I-90 and a dead woman's voice and a little wooden box in a parking lot in Rockford, Illinois, to remind us it was never something we needed to earn at all. Now I want to ask you something, and I want you to really sit with it before you answer. If you were Martin Cole, if you were that person, successful by every measure the world respects, but quietly, privately, deeply lost, what would it have taken to wake you up? Would it have been the accident? Would it have been the dreams? Or would you have kept going, the way so many of us do, choosing the familiar numbness of busyness over the terrifying openness of being truly known? And what about the people in your life right now, the Ellies, the Walters, the Dorothys, who are waiting for you to show up? Not the version of you that has it all together, just the real version, the one that's maybe a little scared, a little worn down, and still, underneath everything, exactly who you were before the world taught you to hide it. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Tell me which part of this story hit you the hardest. Tell me if you've ever felt like Martin, surrounded by success, but hollow inside. Tell me if someone you've lost has ever shown up in a dream and said something that changed the way you saw your own life. Because I think more people have those stories than we realize. And I think they deserve to be shared. This is the kind of story that stays with you. And if it stayed with you today, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Not someone who's obviously struggling, someone who looks like they have it all together. They might need it most. And if you think this story moved you, wait until you hear what we have coming next. A story about a woman who survived something no one should survive and built the life she was supposed to have on the other side of it. You are going to want to be subscribed when that one goes up. Hit that subscribe button. Leave a comment. And thank you, genuinely, for watching all the way to the end. Stories like this only reach the people who need them, Because people like you choose to stay.